So I'm going to introduce to you Lucas, Roger, and Erin. They're going to be speaking with you about commissioning and writing music for niche techniques. And this could include a variety of things. They're going to demonstrate some of these items for you and talk a little bit about that. So if you have questions, we do have the Q&A function and the chat enabled. Feel free to type in the chat and we'll have some time at the end for questions. So thanks so much. Enjoy.
All right, hello everyone. I'm going to turn on my screen share here, so you're not really going to see my face all that well, but that'll be easier for us to do this. Okay, so yeah, my name is Lucas Giannini. I am a freelance clarinetist and teacher in North Carolina, near Charlotte area. I'll let everyone else introduce themselves.
Sure, I'll go next. I'm Roger Zare. I'm a composer. I teach composition and theory at Appalachian State University. And I am not a clarinetist. I've actually never played a clarinet, but I've written many hours of music for clarinet, and I absolutely love writing for clarinet.
My name is Erin Cameron. I teach clarinet at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and I'm also a composer. So I guess I'm a composer and clarinetist.
Yeah, so you're going to get three very different perspectives here. And the reason I had these two join me was Erin wrote a piece for me last year for the Reno Clarinet Fest that you'll get to hear a little bit of in a little bit. And Roger is currently working on a piece that features the same technique for me that will be premiered at some point in the future. We haven't quite decided when that's going to happen, but we'll talk about those pieces, the procedures for writing those things, how to find a composer to write something as niche as this is, and we'll also demonstrate the technique. And so the first thing we'll talk about here is why would you even want to commission new music, especially when you want to talk about new pieces of music that focus on something really out of the box, right? Which is what we're doing. So the general reasons people commission new music, right? Maybe they want to have some sort of personal growth, or they want to have an effect on the field as a whole. They want to introduce people to new music in general. That's always something that a lot of us love doing. Maybe they have a particular theme in their life. Maybe there's something major to happen, or maybe they just enjoy a particular theme and they want to highlight that, so they'll have a composer write for them that way. Or they might want to work with a specific composer, right? Or it can be a combination of all that. And then the one that's more relevant here is I wanted to expand the repertoire for a specific technique, which in this case is the fluting technique, which if you have not heard of, it involves playing the clarinet without a mouthpiece. And essentially what you're doing is you are blowing on it kind of like a flute. Let me turn on my original sound here, which I do not see how to do in this way. Well, anyway, let me turn off the screen share for just a second so I can turn my original sound on, and we'll share the screen again. Just as a warning, this might be a little bit loud, so if you're wearing headphones, I'll turn my gain down a little bit, but this might get a little bit loud. So here's some examples of the music that has been written for this. There really doesn't exist a whole lot of music for this technique, so I learned it for Eric Mandat's folk songs, and I got kind of annoyed that I spent all that time learning a technique that was just not useful for anything else. So I decided I'm going to take it upon myself to just start commissioning music for this technique, right? And here, first I'll play the piece on the right for you, which is Erin's piece from last year, and she'll talk about it a little bit later in her process on this. But I'll just play, this is just the first page of several for the piece. I'll just play a little bit of it. Oops, this one, I actually need a barrel for this one, so that's one of the things you got to talk about. Right, and I'll stop there for that piece. And here on the left, we have a sketch for, this is basically the first sketch from the piece that Roger is writing for me. And we're in the extreme early stages of this. So right now we basically have, you know, some ideas, and we're kind of learning of what we can and can't do with this technique. So this one, we take the barrel off. And I'll just play a little bit of it. Right, so that is just a little sampling of what this technique can do. Is then you probably notice that this is not playing the clarinet in very traditional means, right? So moving on, we'll let one of my other colleagues here talk about finding a composer.
Sure. Well, Lucas, thank you for playing my very weird piece for a clarinet played like a flute, and thank you for for championing it so much. So looking at who we have in the attending this webinar, I see we have a lot of people who are very experienced commissioning, premiering new music. So I'm sure people have a lot of different thoughts about finding a composer to work with. But what I'll say from my experience working with Lucas is that I really appreciated him reaching out to me, because on the one hand, we're friends, we're connected, we like hanging out together. But on the other hand, we share kind of aesthetic interests. So when he asked me to write a piece for Clarinet Played Like a Flute, I really appreciated it, because I knew there's really not maybe a huge number of people in the world who have that kind of specific interest. And he knows that I love kind of, weird off the beaten path kind of sounds and, ways of creating. I'm always trying to find kind of, a different way of doing it and exploring the sounds that, that I don't hear as often. So it really was the perfect collaboration. And so some of these things that that Lucas has set up in this finding a composer link in his presentation, just being aware of, somebody that you can collaborate with regularly. Obviously I'm a clarinet player, so it made sense that he reached out to me to write this piece for him. But interestingly, I can't do the fluting technique myself. It's very, very difficult for me. I have tried. So writing this piece for Lucas, which we'll talk a little bit more about the process later, but writing it was actually really interesting because it was innately incredibly collaborative, because neither of us really knew what sounds would come out. And so it's a good thing that we're friends with each other, because we spent a lot of time on Zoom going back and forth trying to make sure that the sounds I had in mind actually worked, and that the ideas I'd been trying to noodle around with actually would be possible when playing the clarinet like a flute. I'll go ahead and pass the baton back to Lucas so that we can keep on and talk a little bit about the composing process.
Right. So thank you, Erin. We'll move on here. Obviously, every composer has a different process for writing music. So we'll have Roger explain his process a little bit and how we're kind of working together at this point, and what he's thinking about as we explore this basically new instrument.
Yeah, it really does feel like a brand new instrument. And that's the really interesting thing, because I've written so much for clarinet before. I'm very experienced. I know what I want a clarinet to do and how it sounds. And now that I'm working on this piece, I feel like I'm not familiar with anything that is coming out, and it's all brand new to me, which is exciting. But Yeah, it's the process is actually very different for me because I've written so much for clarinet, especially for extended techniques. That's part of how Lucas got to know me through the work that I did with Andy Hudson on our 2 etude books on focusing on extended techniques. And so he knew that I was into this kind of stuff, into making weird noises and trying to make music out of them in a strange way. And so I heard him play the fluting piece that Erin wrote at Reno. And he said, "Hey, you want to try doing something for that too?" And I was definitely a yes. Now that I'm getting into the process, it really feels like I'm not even sure like where I can go to explore. So Lucas and I met, and he gave me some materials and demonstrated a lot for me. And my process is usually pretty independent because I've written so much music and I work, very much independently normally. But for this piece, because it's a brand new instrument, essentially, I'm going a lot more back and forth with Lucas, sending him ideas, hearing demonstrations of the ideas, learning from him what's working and what's not working and what's possible and maybe what slight different things to do. And that's really enlightening and is, I think, going to help me figure out how to use this technique effectively in the end, which I'm not anywhere near there yet, I feel like. And so every composer is going to have a different way that they approach. I'm not able to try this technique out myself, and so I really have to rely on this collaboration. But other performers may be able to try it out as they're writing for it, and that might make it a little easier on them. And so it's important, be as open as you can to working closely with the composer or not. If they decide they'll just write a whole bunch of music and send it to you, that's perfectly fine because that's the way that they like to work. But they also might find that they don't know how to write for this new technique well enough. And so giving them some very clear demonstration. I know it's great to have those YouTube videos demonstrating strange techniques. That is a perfect way to make it public so that people have a good reference for what sounds come out when things are notated in certain ways or things are asked for in certain ways. And that is such a good resource for the composer if they can't meet with you in person.
Right. And, speaking of those materials, so here's on the right here of the screen, you're going to see this. When I was first starting working with Erin, I had to create a whole pitch chart on, so the bottom staff, this is a two-staff system here, and the bottom staff is the written pitch on the instrument, so the pitch I would finger, and then the top staff would be the pitch that actually comes out of the instrument. And you might notice that I have it divided with no barrel and barrel, and with fluting, it's actually interesting. You can do all sorts of different things. I mean, you can play on pretty much any individual piece of the instrument, and you can flute it, right? Like, right? You can do it on the barrel. I did it on a ligature once. I'm not going to try that here. That was a little silly. But the, I also put different pitch tendencies in here in the chart, right? Because all these notes are just not in tune. And essentially what we're doing with this technique is turning it into a flute. So our first approach was, okay, what techniques exist in the flute? And can we actually do these with just this version of flute, right? Turns out a lot of them you can. Turns out a lot of them you can't. We found that out very quickly. So, Erin, was there some other stuff that I sent you that was really useful?
Yeah, well, I was gonna, point to this same chart as well. And kind of the system that Lucas and I arrived at was a system I've used before when writing for like scordatura string instruments, where we have a fingered note and then the sounding pitch that comes out. And clarinetists, I mean, as a clarinetist, I almost never read music that's notated that way. But we discovered, even playing just a standard major scale, F major scale, when you're fluting, it comes out with all these really, intriguing and detailed microtones that the clarinet, that we don't normally achieve so easily through the clarinet without using alternate fingerings or, manipulating the embouchure. So that actually really, and as kind of, a composer who likes charts and like organization and lists, I kind of find myself inspired by those kind of organizational systems. This chart actually really kind of in itself was a source of inspiration for me. And Lucas sent this to me, and I was just looking through, and I thought, wow, if we just play, some really standard combinations of fingerings without even, adding too much else to it, we're going to end up with such a cool result with so many, microtones in it. So that's actually how, so in the work that we worked on together, I ended up using so many really basic fingering combinations. Part of a D minor scale is the root of a lot of the sounds that come out of that piece, and then just allowing whatever microtones happen to come out using those fingerings, and just embracing the sounds that come out from using, kind of maybe a standard fingering system from the way we're trained, using scales and sounds like that, but then playing the clarinet in this really unusual way.
Yeah,
and then,
Oh,
I'm
sorry,
so
go ahead.
sorry, Roger. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead, finish your thought.
I have just one more sentence to say about it, and then it ended up that the way Lucas wrote this chart out is what we arrived at as being the most efficient way to notate the piece as well, with the fingering on the bottom, and then the approximate resulting pitch in a separate staff up at the top, so that Lucas and other future performers kind of know what to expect, what sounds are going to come out.
Yeah, this chart is so fantastic for me, and I'm referring to it constantly because not all pitches are possible, but that microtonal variation that you get is what's fascinating me most about this technique, besides the timbre being so surprising. But yeah, like writing a scale that doesn't come out exactly right, I'm definitely looking to explore that, and that's inspiring some of the pitches that I'm choosing. Most of what I've written so far is chromatic pitches fingered, which are ending up being farther apart than normal, and I love that kind of weirdness of the sound. So yeah, this chart is fantastic, and definitely finding the best way to notate this. And it was nice to see Erin's score and see how, and I've written for score to tour strings, where it's like the pitch that comes out has nothing to do with sometimes where you're putting your finger, because everything's weird on the instrument. So the same thing is happening here. It's now a shorter length of tubing, so the pitches are getting in places that you're not expecting them. And I'm basically, I have this chart open on one screen and I've got Sibelius open in the other, and I'm just going back and forth and figuring out, okay, how do I need to make this pitch happen?
Right, and just before we move on, just one last thing to talk about here. I'll just go back a couple of screens here so you can see the way they notated it. This is also the way Eric Mandat notated this technique in his folk songs. And one of the things that is more difficult if you're a composer and you're not able to process this technique yourself, is that sometimes what you will find out is that the pitches you wrote, even with the chart I gave them, are not accurate, especially as you're doing certain extended techniques. So for example, in Erin's piece, the pitch she wanted was that F sharp, and normally you would play that by just fingering an open G, but she also wants me to hum a third below. And when you do that, if you do it really loud, you actually have to finger a half step below in order for the pitch it'll bring the pitch up. So when you're humming, you have to be aware of that as well. And these are the kinds of things that, if you're working with someone on this kind of technique, and if it's something that niche, this is where things like recordings and constant communication back and forth, like Roger has actually sent me, this is the second sketch that he sent me, and the first one I was like, yeah, this works, this doesn't work, right? And this sketch I already told him, like, hey, that stuff on the bottom there with those low notes, if you want a really low airy sound, that sounds great, but if you want it to actually be a real pitch, you're just not going to hear that at that range. And so, and we're both kind of experimenting, like, because even though I feel like I can do this technique fairly well, it's not like it's as natural to me as playing the clarinet regularly, right? So we're definitely doing a lot of experimenting. So just to move on just a little bit here, let's talk about funding, because this is something that usually in the composition process gets kind of ignored by a lot of people, especially performers. We love talking about getting new music written, but then we kind of forget that composers need to make a living as well. How do you find funding for a piece, right? Because there's a lot of different avenues there, and the most obvious way would be just paying out of pocket. If you got that kind of money, that's great. That's nice, quick, and simple. But that can be really expensive, and that's really not desirable in most cases. And it's also not a desirable way for just for getting the piece out to an audience, because a lot of times the audience you're going to get it sometimes can be part of the commissioning process with you. So the most popular way I've seen new pieces being commissioned, doesn't matter what kind of piece it is, would be consortiums, where a group of people spreads out the cost of the piece, and usually the leading consortium member. So like when I did Erin's piece, we did a consortium. I paid a set fee that was higher, and then we had other people join in, and we had agreed like, okay, basically we'll see how many people join in, and then if we don't get to a certain amount, I will cover the rest of that, and if we do, then I will still pay this base amount. It was kind of how we worked with that. And you can get really creative with these if you're trying to set up a consortium. It's usually better if one person organizes it, but you can get creative with it. Like, for me with Roger's piece, if we do a consortium, I'd be like, okay, well, one of the benefits, if you put a higher amount of money into the consortium, maybe I can give you a 1 hour lesson on fluting, that kind of idea, something like that. You can get creative with these to get really quite a bit of help in paying the composers. There's also a lot of grants you can apply for if you're in school. If you're part of an academic institution, usually there's tons of grants there, especially for graduate students. A lot of schools also have undergraduate research. You can basically apply for any kind of grant if you put a title that's good enough. So just you can find a way to fit pretty much any project into most grants. So look at what your school offers if you're a part of that. Both performers and composers are able to apply for different things. There's also grants that are not school-based. There's some private organizations, research organizations. There's local, regional, national organizations. I know Canadian composers have tons of options as well. Less so in the United States, unfortunately. I don't know the case in Europe. But there's tons of things like the Chamber Music Society, the Chamber Music of America, I believe is what they're called. They have grants that they offer, that kind of deal, right? So definitely look into that. And then you have to decide something early on as far as payment methods. And you relatively early in the process. It doesn't have to be the first thing you discuss, but fairly early on, you should probably talk to the composer about what will this end up costing, what you think is going to be a fair amount, respect what they believe is a fair amount for the amount of work they're doing. You can negotiate a little bit, but like be reasonable, they're doing this and this is their job. And different payment methods, right? Like I've done Venmo, I've done PayPal, you can just do cash, check, whatever. And just as far as payment methods go, find a way that's comfortable for both of you to get this to work. The benefit of doing a lot of this too is that if you are, say, a private instructor or you're a freelancer, you can actually put this in your taxes as a business expense. So definitely anything you spend money on that involves your profession, you should definitely put that in your taxes, and that gives you a little bit of a tax break, at least in the US. And yeah, just make sure you're discussing this kind of thing early on, because you don't want it to come up as a surprise later, and then the composer did all this work and you're not able to pay for it.
Yeah, it's really important. Make a contract and get things in writing early on so that you have that to fall back on.
Yeah, contracts are great. The other thing too is making sure that when you're doing a consortium, there's some sort of contract in there for the people that are entering the consortium, so that they know, here's the rights that I have. Usually the standard is like, you get like a year of performance rights before anyone else can play in it. Usually the leading consortium member gets the first premiere, and then everyone else can kind of co-premiere the piece or play for the next year. And then that piece can go out to the general public. That's pretty standard. A lot of times you might also be able to, work it out to where you're getting a recording out to the composer. I still owe Erin some recordings, which I've done, but I have not. I keep forgetting to send her. But yeah, there's definitely things that you can work out with the composers. So anything else to add before we move on to some questions that people might have? All right. So just going into some questions here. I see one question that has shown up here. Someone's asking about how I approached learning this technique in the first place. There's a really good video called, it's like the Clarinet flute. It's Sean Osborne has it on YouTube. That's pretty much the only video I've seen on fluting that actually worked for me, but there's probably others. And I'll be honest with you, what I did was I took a morning out of my day. I just took a morning And I spent like 2 or 3 hours just going. And then eventually it just kind of worked. And I'm like, okay, I did it once by accident. How did that work out, right? So if you, yeah, a lot of it is experimentation. And this is the case with most extended techniques. You will find that you can find someone to kind of teach it to you, but you just kind of have to experiment until the technique works. And if you do it by accident once, you know it's possible. And if someone else is able to do it, you know it's possible. There's no reason if someone else is able to do it that you can't do it, right? So just keep experimenting until it works out. Sometimes it takes longer. I know slap tonguing took me about 2 years to learn. Jason Alder now has a new YouTube short. I see his in the participants here, and he has a new YouTube short that's actually really good. Go watch that one. It's probably one of the better videos I've seen on it explaining it. I see another person. Is it Bieler? I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name here. Feel free to ask your question. Go ahead. And while they're getting ready here, I see another piece. Oh yeah, how can you improve yourselves in this regard? I mean, the same way you improve yourself in pretty much any thing. You just have to practice it a bunch. I spent quite a bit of time. I took a flute lesson. I took a lesson from a flute teacher to figure out how to do this without feeling like I'm dying. I see Jim Casey is asking, so if you pay a commission, this might be a better question for Roger or Erin. If you pay a commission to get a piece composed for you, then it gets published. Does the person who paid the composer get any money?
Not usually. And often in the contract, there will be a clause saying that the composer retains rights to the piece, which means they retain ownership of the title and all the music that they composed as intellectual rights or property. So the commissioners don't necessarily make any money after the piece exists and goes out into the world.
Yeah, you can make money out of the piece by performing it, and you can get money from the performances themselves, right? Or you can get money out of, maybe you can do something in the contract, like maybe there's a recording and you can get money from the album sales or anything like that, or if those happen, right? That's hard. But yeah, usually, in my experience, usually any kind of composer fee from like ASCAP or anything like that goes to the composer, not the performer.
Yeah, and the publisher will have their own contract with the composer to show that usually the publisher owns the rights to the piece, and then the composer gets some cut of the sales, and that's how it works.
Yeah, so we are running out of time here. So if you do have any other questions for us, any of the three of us, we have our emails on the screen here. You also have our websites that you can use to get in contact with us. Feel free to message me on social media or whatever too. I don't mind that. So yeah, thank you all for your time. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the share here.
Thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge on this process, and we look forward to seeing Roger's piece. So feel free to check out Roger and Erin's websites as well as Lucas for information about the works that they have written for clarinet. And I just want to give Roger a plug here. He is a winner of our ICA composition contest in his work. The Last Question will be performed. He was premiered this summer, but it will be performed as part of the composition winners recital later on during this event. So I hope you will enjoy that performance. Our next session is starting over on YouTube shortly. I'm going to drop the link here in the chat. Feel free to follow the link over there, and we will see you on the next event. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all.